Welcome, 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 and the deepest appreciation for everyone who have turned up on time, who've joined us this evening to share in this very unique experience. We had an overwhelming registration of over 250 people who wanted to be a part of this very unique discourse. So we're really appreciative. We'd like to acknowledge the very important and dynamic process for our being here. Reclaiming Community Heritage began as a series of community consultations right here in Brixton. The coordinators of that event named the project 81 Acts of Exuberant Defiance. And they created a manifesto, some of it will be on, you'll see it on your seats, a manifesto of community engagement related to research, training, participatory planning, and tangible installations for heritage reclamation. Their hard work and commitment formed the seed for the project that we're now involved in, which is called Reclaiming Community Heritage. Reclaiming Community Heritage is a 2-year project made possible through a partnership process primarily between the Ubele Initiative and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. But there have been lots of partners along the way with the Arts Council, people in the community, different private groups. So different things have manifested all along the way during the life of the 2-year project. This Reclaiming Community Heritage project asks us to consider the many ways in which training and awareness strengthening can take place in our communities to bring us into a collective understanding of our shared histories. Reclaiming Community Heritage asks us to consider the events and activities and legacies of the 1981 uprisings. When we speak about training, it led us to a consideration of the many ways to communicate shared heritage within our communities. This sharing we've called acts. This is how the acts part of it is. An act is a creative intervention in memory, in the way we have collective recollection and understanding of our past. Some acts have already taken place. However, our headline act, you're not too late for, takes place in 2 weeks' time with a grand opening ceremony at the Black Community Archives right here in Windrush Square. So if any of you have any time, please come on down and see it. We have been privileged with the stories of 35 people who have shared their very personal, lived experiences of the uprisings of 1981. These have been translated into short, thought-provoking stories. And our storytellers have shared not only their stories, but also their shoes. We're inviting you all to come. You're going to understand what I mean when you go down here and see it. We're inviting you to come and experience this very exciting act. It's called A Mile in My Shoes Uprisings, brought to us by the Empathy Museum, who are partnering with us to commemorate the Brixton April uprisings of 1981 and the England uprisings in July of the same year. But we know uprisings don't just happen in 1 year or through one context. It's an accumulative thing that happens all through the country and it's building, so there are different stories from different parts of the country. The Empathy Museum, in producing this act of memory, opens up a path for other acts to follow. The Reclaiming Community Heritage Project have put out a call for other acts of remembrance, of legacy, and of heritage. You may have seen this on our Instagram page, 81 Acts. You'll see it on the Facebook page, and there's a website. So the call is still open, but it will be closed by Monday, the 3rd of April, which is Monday coming. We're collectively issuing £4,000 available for boundary-pushing, innovative expressions and manifestations of what we have inherited. Our legacies and lessons from our history of resistance and uprisings. In other words, you can put in for an application. You don't have much time. to be able to, but you have to stand on the pillars of these very special, the Human Manifesto that you all have outlines exactly what it is. So thank you for coming and for registering online to join with us this evening. 1981, Inheriting Black Women's Resistance. You know, we felt that this was a really special conversation, a dialogue that we've got this evening, because very often when we have stories of resistance, we see a silence when it comes to presenting the stories of our women. Their voices and perspectives, our memories, and our stories are often neglected, disregarded, and not called upon in presenting the greater picture. So we feel this is a really important opportunity to share, to open, to question, to interrogate the whole experience that women play in uprisings, in revolts, in change. Tonight, we seek to enable a process of remembering, reclaiming, and respecting. And we're blessed with being able to share an intergenerational conversation across time and space and the company that we're with. My name is Arlene. I work with the Reclaiming Community Heritage Project with Ubele, and we're going to meet some very dynamic and interesting and, oh, well, you can tell me the words when you send in your comments, women. We will be introducing them. We're all first name people, so I'm a first name person. I'm Arlene, and I'm going to hand over to Sherry, who's going to start to warm us up a little bit, and then our other sisters will be joining us in a little while. So thank you all. We look forward to an exciting couple of hours. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Cherie Taylor-Baptiste. The first poem that I want to do for you today, it was written at a time when I just become a single parent again and I was moving house. My mum was also at end of life. I was trying to get my son into a high school, my daughter into a primary school, and someone at the school gate asked how I was doing, and I briefly told them. It was a white middle-class mum from the school, and she said, oh, I really admire that you keep going, but black women are strong like that. And so I went home and I wrote this poem, and it's called Withholding Breath. No one sees how I seal my mouth when the waves come down, when the names and assumptions bounce around. Someone told me that they admired that I kept going. But black women are strong like that, they said. Like there's a choice in the storms, like the myth we're bred and born rather than made resilient. Like we arrive ready for trauma, want to dive into rapids. As if we're unaware that people duck faster at the chips they imagine flying from our shoulders and assume that we will outlast the white waves with our strong words. That we're reinforced, not unendorsed, unheard. Not seeing we must be elastic within, not white, not men. Gymnastic in our swim since the curse that scattered us on Atlantic seabed full as mermaids' purse. They said we didn't cry for the milk, wet nursed to babies who would grow to choose to avoid our eyes. Not only Billy sang the blues, we're aware of what we lose in the tides. Thinking that we're static as an old woman at the edge of a village created for tourists, a plantation reenactment shelved, or that we all sit somehow cushioned by the concepts of ourselves, or that we somehow had a choice and chose not to be an easier someone else. Believing that black woman is just the things that happen to us. Intersectionality, a subheading, racism, misogyny, us making waves, not our constant swim. So I seal my mouth as the waves come down, and then I seal it again to hold my own waves in. Thank you. And the next poem I'm wanting to do is called Kintsugi. Kintsugi is a Japanese art. Broken pot is put back together and fused with a lacquer of gold and honey. And that pot is seen as more beautiful because of the new resilience it has and also because of the stories it holds. And I just think it's a lovely metaphor for the kind of resilience that we often build up as black women. And it's called, yes, Kintsugi. I am black. My glue is gold and has the shine of insects' wings. I am the pot dropped as hands forgot to hold. Many impacts sting. In time lapse, I watch myself fold, remoulding implicit in exquisite way I implode. I'm not delicate. I'm not fixed. Yes, sometimes shattered to bits, but in the mixed up pieces can bend. So I'm not fixed. And there's nothing to mend. I gather myself in bits, reassembling to ascend to a form without the trick of having to pretend. And I'm tender with ragged scarring, removing jagged, jarring pieces of ivory towers, of those who deny there can be power in hourglass curves, those who on seeing painted lip from pot want to sip, ignoring it's embossed with unglossed, unheard words. And I dismiss as suspect the pieces of others who made me other, a foreign object, who tried to melt as wax my melanin black, whose flames I swerved. And I pull no punches with the pieces abusers smashed, as if I was owned, as if I was made of glass they themselves had blown. These pieces porous with surrender have no place. They wouldn't render. My pot would rock, would be debased. They have no space in my rebirth. I remove the isms, the doubt dynamics, fill schisms with truth grout, recenter ceramics. Rejected pieces I study first, then I release them far from me. I pummel them, bury them, I take their thirsty dark from me. And in their place, pieces etched with my son and daughter's face. I carve imprints of newborn hands. To hold these fragments, golden honey most refined, erupts as molten magnet down ducts of gaps, a magma sublime. And I layer and layer the love they stick to me. Rich, sturdy bits, dishevelled with mess and grit. On the map of my cracks, their beveled world, continents on globe, moon and sun by which whole vessel is lit. Amphitheatre, the story that sits in the space I hold. And I funnel the crushed diamonds of the memory of my mum's eyes as she smiled. Drizzling her dazzle, the glaze drifts like dreams. So if flawed in my trials, her gemstones are resewn in newly grown seams. Having life as muse ensures contours more than before. Landscapes heal aftershocks of quakes, reseal to abstract, extract new face inch by inch, so anywhere I'm placed is my plinth, and I rinse and I buff. I never glance back to the form before cracks. Mosaic of resilience enough. I unfold, eclipsing prosaic with brilliance of black and gold, shape I was meant to be, beautiful dents in me and my kintsugi rich. Because I'm pot dropped as hands forgot to hold. I'm not delicate, I'm not fixed. Yes, sometimes shattered to bits, but in the mixed up pieces can bend. So I'm not fixed, and there's nothing to mend. Thank you. Thank you.
You know, at times when we were under siege and dealing with loss and fragmentation, quite often it's the women who are the glue that Cherie talked about. I love that analogy. You know, when you were doing that poem, it made me think of Mary Prince. I've been doing a lot of work around women and slavery, and I hope you've all read my book, A Kick in the Belly, but if you haven't, you rush out and buy it now. But there's a very poignant piece about Mary Prince, who broke a pot, and she got flogged repeatedly for that. So that's what came to my head, and it's such a powerful metaphor. But yeah, we're that glue, aren't we, quite often, the women. And I think in the case of OAD, it's about not just recognizing that, but also recognizing how important women were in helping to forge the politics. You know, if you think about OAD, which we'll talk about, I think, shortly, the Organization of Women of Asian and African Descent, we were very focused on having a politics that drove our activity. We weren't just about reacting to whatever happened on the street. We actually put it into a framework, and it was a framework that was partly Pan-Africanist, about a recognition of the connectivity across the diaspora. It was partly about recognizing the shared struggles of those who were on the receiving end of colonialism and imperialism. And, you know, it was absolutely vital that we played that role, because quite often there was a reaction on the street, and without that kind of theoretical framework, it kind of got lost in translation. So I think I've probably said enough. There are other things I was going to say. Yeah, just one more thing. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that point about continuity. There was an article in The Guardian recently that said unemployment in Brixton is still 40% among black youth. It's still 3 times higher than their white counterparts. And that is a mirror image of the situation in 1981. So there's no room for complacency. And I suppose my abiding hope is that we go out of today's session feeling empowered and strengthened by the discussion and by the continuities that we're going to be exploring.
Thank you so much. There's so much kind of like rich detail in what you've both said. And I really appreciate what you said, Suzanne, about a focus on political consciousness. And I guess that would be somewhere to start, because I agree that when we think about, you know, the grand narrative of history, there are some limitations in trying to plot Black history along a timeline with major and minor events. There's so much, like you said, like the care work, the gendered labor that gets lost in that formation. And so I guess I wanted to ask you, both of you, what the crafting of a political consciousness at this moment was like. What was that process like and how did you do it collectively with others? How did it begin? How did you continue to sustain it? Because I think we're also talking about a moment in history or a time where there was lots of like government funding, I guess, or like local council funding for autonomous forms of organizing, right? We're talking about a time where it was much easier to squat a building, where there was some sense that you could build collectivity and organize with others. And so I'm interested in the crafting of that politics, where it began, and how both the Brixton Black Women's Group and OAD came to a definition of an understanding of like Black womanhood as related to race, class, and gender.
I think I'm going to answer that personally, because, and so I would say that there are two, in terms of crafting a consciousness then, if I understand your question, that there were two ways of forming groups in the period that I was in South London. And there was, as Stella was saying, groups such as OAD and Brixton Black Women's Group, where I was, the Brixton Defence Campaign, that had Race Today. I wasn't involved in Race Today, but we were adjacent to Race Today, that had specific ideological framework. So we had a sort of, we wrote down our sort of our objectives. We defined ourselves as Black socialist feminists, and we elaborated on that definition so that we were in dialogue with other groups, often male-dominated groups that were quite a little bit antagonistic to the idea of Black feminism. And so we were constantly seeking to explain exactly what that meant not for ourselves so much, but for others. So we're in dialogue with others, always outward facing, always reaching out, but from a position that also privileged, you know, ideology and politics and theory. All of us in the women's group in the Defence Campaign were also working in the community. At one time, I was working at the supplementary school, but I had other jobs within the community. And alongside Marcia Wright, who's no longer with us, who founded Gresham Supplementary School, and next to us was the Abeng. Now, that's another site, another arena within which a kind of collective black consciousness was developed. But in those spaces, you know, there were no manifestos, there was no kind of self-conscious ideology, there was no looking inwards. It was very much action-based. So it was about, for example, after April 1981, there was a lot of focus on supporting mostly young men. They were young men who had been criminalised, not only by the events of April 1981, but really before that and after. And so they saw themselves, they used this phrase, crimers. They saw themselves as crimers. That's how the state had defined them. And so we did a lot of work with those young men and with the families of those young men, their grandmothers, aunts, and so on and so forth. But that was informed, I would say, by our ideology. But the purpose of it was to develop and build a kind of community, a collective black consciousness within those groups and among those young people, but not in a specifically ideological way. So, and I think that mirrored lots of people's experiences. I think I was fairly typical in straddling those two kinds of groups. And I think the majority of the activism was local and practical and hands-on, and that was key to the development of a collective consciousness.
I suppose you've basically covered most of it. I think what I would add to that is that we came from a wide range of backgrounds. Certainly, I had a background in trade unionism. I believed and still do in the power of unions. But I'm also of African descent, and that means that at that time I always had a very close eye on what was happening on the African continent. We're talking about, through the 70s, a whole number of liberation struggles in which we were beginning to grapple with the role of women, you know, because you were seeing women in places like Zimbabwe who were literally coming out of their villages barefoot and taking up a gun, you know, and you would expect those women to gain something from that process, but we were also hearing from some women that once the struggle was won, they were back in the kitchen barefoot and pregnant and expected to pick up where they'd left off. So there was a whole series of discussions going on amongst ourselves about what it meant to be a revolutionary woman, what we wanted for us, whether for women to come together and organise together was indeed splitting the black struggle, which was one of the accusations that we faced, and also whether our efforts to organise as women was in some way a kind of attempt to imitate what white women were doing. That was a very powerful critique from our brothers, who said, oh, you're just a bunch of lesbians and you want to act like white women. Actually, my own feminism came from the place I've described, from looking at what's happening on the African subcontinent. And it was only subsequently that I began to sort of look at what women were doing, white women in the liberation movement, it's still embryonic, and begin to see the connections between what they were saying about women and what we were saying. But I think Suzanne made a very important point earlier about supporting the young men. The thing that made our black feminism unique and distinct, and I think enduring, is that we never defined men as the enemy. We always saw what we were doing as women as fundamental to the advancement of our communities. And we knew that we couldn't do that without brothers, sons, partners, lovers, you know, that whole plethora of people in our community who weren't necessarily defining themselves as women, but nevertheless stood to gain from the kinds of issues we were taking up. And those issues weren't just what you would traditionally call feminist issues. If you look at the agenda for the first OAD conference, we were looking at employment, education, our relationship with the welfare state, you know, a whole range of issues which, yes, impacted on us as women, but also had huge ramifications for our communities.
I think also what's really interesting, if you think about the ways groups like the Brixton Black Women's Group and OAD have been historicized, is that there isn't, in my understanding, a real focus on the fact that there was a robust critique of capitalism that was like baked into how people were organizing. Often when those movements are spoken about, it's through the lens of like identity or like Black women's experience, which is not unimportant. But what drew me specifically at like as a researcher and just in general to groups like the Brixton Black Women's Group and OAD was that they understood and were thinking about their material conditions and thinking about how to transform them, right? They understood themselves as positioned in a like under capitalism and as workers, which is I'm really glad you brought in what you said about trade unionism, because even when we're thinking about the continuities, these are all some of the same questions that we're like facing. I guess to kind of zip through, I'm interested in thinking about the events of 1981, but actually specifically about to ask you more about the organizing that happened against like sus laws, if you could contextualize and explain what that was, and also Operation Swamp that triggered the Brixton riots, this kind of indiscriminate targeting of like Black men by plainclothes police officers. I think something like 1,000 stops were made, 150 arrests. So I'm interested in the kind of organizing around sus that was happening before 1981, and then how, like you said, Suzanne, there was able to be a mass mobilization in 1981 because all of these groups were kind of working together.
Yeah, there's I think we could both address bits of that. I think that first of all, that the the swamping of Black communities by the police was ongoing. You know, so that it wasn't. It might have reached a climax in 1981, but it might also have been the limit. You know, that we had reached our limit because this the stop and search and the sort of swamping of communities, the indiscriminate arrests and so on was something that we'd all grown up with. You know, if we had brothers, I had brothers who were stopped and searched routinely, arrested, and this was outside of London, arrested, incarcerated. So we had lived with that. And specifically to the sus law, which is a sort of version of the Vagrancy Act, it was a woman, Mavis Clark, who really initiated and brought to fruit and really campaigned at the expense of so much of her own personal life. She sought to bring an end to what we called a sus law. She coordinated with Black lawyers at the time, other community groups and so on. But it was really Mavis who spearheaded it. And I think those of you who remember her would remember that she was the person that mobilized around that. But it's something as well that she was able to do because everybody was attuned to the injustice of it, and because the injustices of it were right next to us. They were in our lives, in our families, and in the classroom, in our community groups and so on. We were all victims of it in one way or another. And so she was able to network with women and community groups and youth clubs and so on that were able to enable her to mobilise, to actually take a legal position that resulted in it being disbanded. So I think that might be the answer to part of the question. I can't remember what.
I just wanted to say something about OAD because we're making the assumption that everybody knows how it worked, and I think it is important to just sort of lay out the concept of OAD, because OAD was really just developed as an umbrella organisation. We saw all this activity going on in our communities, not just in London, but across the country, places like Toxteth and St Paul's and Moss Side, and we felt the need to be able to come together and speak, if not with one voice, at least to have a kind of collective starting point for a discussion about what was happening to black women and the demands black women were making. So it was really a kind of harnessing of all that energy under this umbrella group OAD, which really just brought those women together, produced a newsletter, held regular conferences and study days, and created a network in a context which I suspect most people looking around the room will find hard to even conceptualize. No mobile phones, no emails, you know, none of the social media that exists today. We relied exclusively on our own informal networks and grapevines and people who knew people who knew people. And it was powerful. The first OAD conference was held just across the road in the Abeng Centre in 78, was it, or 79? And we had no idea how many people were going to come, but 200 odd women turned up. And it was one of the most empowering moments of my life, seeing all those black women for the first time ever together in one room. So to come back to your original question, which is how that feminist consciousness developed, it was kind of embryonic, it was organic, it was fed into by all those groups who were coming from different levels. Some had more students and sort of theoretical issues going on. Others, like the group I was in North London, Tottenham, we had United Black Women's Action Group. We just, like, if we heard something through one of our sisters who was planted in the local law centre, so we kind of found out anything that was going on before anyone else knew. You know, we just were there. We were outside Tottenham Nick saying, you know, release the brother, or asking, holding them to account. And in the same way, we organised around the sin bins in our local community, because we could see that we're herding our black children into so-called remedial classes while the other kids got on with their O-levels or GCSEs or whatever it was in those days. And our kids were being left a lot, you know, to do nothing, to learn nothing. So I think it's important to understand that the power of OAD was actually in its constituent membership. And one other thing I will say is that very early on, we started off as women of Africa and African descent. You know, we were women of African and Caribbean descent, basically, but we very early on had an encounter with a young Asian woman who was one of that generation of Asian people who'd come from Africa. You remember the expulsions, the Idi Amin and all those things that were going on in East Africa. And she walked into one of our meetings and said, well, what about me? And to be honest with you, she knew probably more about Africa than we did, because she'd lived there and been raised there, but she was of Asian descent. So we very quickly had to get our heads around that sense of not just a diaspora that took in people of African descent, but I suppose what is nowadays referred to as political blackness, that sense that we can make common cause with anyone who has a shared experience of colonialism, imperialism, racism. And although we recognize very early on that the kinds of issues that Asian sisters experience in their communities didn't necessarily coincide with ours, they might experience the racism and the sexism differently, the enemy was the same, and we could make common cause. So in the same way as our community was particularly focused, for example, on the 71 and latter immigration acts, which were splitting our families and which were beginning to chip away at those initial rights, which had started with the Windrush generation being invited to come. In the same way as we were outraged and angered by that, we were equally outraged and angered by the virginity testing that was taking place, because of some skewed perception that if an Asian woman came to Britain, she could only be coming to join her husband, and therefore she must be a virgin, mustn't she, because that's how Asians work. So they were literally stuck with their feet in stirrups as soon as they walked into Heathrow Airport. Now, to us, that was part of the same beast. Yeah, we might experience it differently, but it was part of the same thing. So I think that was a really important underlying principle of the way we organise, that we would not buy into that divide and rule, which so, I mean, if we're talking about lessons, you know, to me, that divide and rule lesson, we really haven't learnt it yet. You know, we squabble amongst ourselves and we have wonderful political groups and initiatives and responses. And before you know it, we're arguing with each other instead of keeping the focus on where we should be directing our energies and our anger. So I think, you know, I'm not saying it was all hunky-dory, I'm not saying it was all perfect, I don't want to idealise it at all, but I do think those basic principles of unity with those that we can make common cause with, in other words, none of the identity politics that we see today, we're all in this boat together, that spirit of collectivism which subsumed the ego. In other words, if you look at FOAD, you've mentioned FOAD, the newsletter, you won't see any names there. Nobody put their names on the articles because it didn't matter who was writing the article. What mattered was that we were trying to speak with one voice. And there was also an aspect of that which was about state surveillance. We didn't want to hand ourselves up to be picked off. And that third tenet was, of course, the anti-imperialism. That sense that we were all first, second generation immigrants to this country, or our parents were. We had close ties with those countries of origin. We cared about what was happening there, but we could see the connections between what's happening there and what was happening here. Yeah, and I think that's another lesson I think really has stood us in good stead as black people, that, you know, we have our ties. If you look at things like the third Radical Black Book Fair, you know, people came from all across the world, from Chile, from South Africa, and we made common cause. We looked at our struggles and we saw what we had in common. And that gave us power and it gave us hope. And I think that fragmentation that I see today actually doesn't end with that same conclusion.
I think there's kind of so much in what you said. And I think it's interesting because without romanticizing and recognizing the tensions is kind of really important to say there is, even within this large formation of different groups, you know, Marxist, Leninist, socialists, etc., like women from different class and class positions and other kinds of positions, there was still a sense that people were able to dissent, and that wouldn't necessarily mean fragmentation, right? Which is why the form of an umbrella group is so interesting in this context, because it's not saying there is a central unifying set of principles. It's saying we understand and recognize that we want to act as a collective body in our political organizing, but that there are different concerns that are local, geographical, that are, you know, determined by, like different sets of political consciousness. I guess also to contextualize, FOAD, as Stella was speaking about, was OAD's newsletter, which had there is actually, we were talking about a reader that's just coming out that collates a lot of the articles from many of the issues of FOAD, but they spoke not only to the group's concerns, but also to the anti-imperialist kind of lens in terms of thinking about what was happening in armed struggles, women's participation in forms of like uprisings on the African continent, etc. I guess the questions that I want to ask, and there's going to be quite a lot here, so take from it what you want to. I'm interested in bringing specific names into the room, because you said it's so important to like name these black women that were kind of central to what was going on, but to talk about how bringing those people into the room is connected to the political legacies that you understood yourself as part of when you were operating in the 70s and 80s. So I'm thinking about people like Jessica Huntley, I'm thinking about Claudia Jones, how they're organizing against like the color bar, and really their communism was kind of central to creating that embryonic like black feminist movement that kind of comes afterwards. So I'm interested in that, as well as relationships to people like Gerlin Bean, Olive Morris, Sylvia Oreke, and so on. And then the second question that I wanted to ask is maybe it's not so much about, I guess, the dissolution of OAD, which is a much asked question, but is more about in preparation for this talk, I was looking at this report that Gurlin Bean and Amrit Wilson were involved in, called the Final Report of the Working Party in Inter-Community Policing Relations, which took up issues of accountability and police surveillance in Lambeth. And this report was a report done by the local council in conversation with grassroots organizers, and I was thinking about in the present day how that doesn't really happen anymore, because a lot of work of that kind of grassroots organization has been shifted onto NGOs and charities. And I wondered if you could reflect on the kind of like depoliticization of grassroots movements because of their reliance on like local government funding under like Ken Livingstone, and how that affected how those movements, which started off as like autonomous Black women's movements, how they transformed them into service providers. So transformed them into spaces where people would go to find out about housing or you know, other resources that weren't available to them.
I think I understand that as three questions. Yes. Okay, so to take the last one first, which is about funding.
Yeah.
I don't think, in speaking of the Brixton Black Women's Group as an example, but there are other groups who also have funding in the sort of later period. They weren't transformed into service providers. That's not what the funding did. And I think it's really important to make that statement that you know, it was ideologically and perhaps politically complex to take funding, but the people who were taking funding were the same people who were committed to political and social transformation. And what the funding did was really to enable us to have an eye on futurity, you know, to think that perhaps we could be in the same building next year, perhaps we could think about planning beyond 6 months and so on. So I think to characterize funding as something that means that you've conceded to a kind of Thatcherite agenda, or you've been co-opted by the state, is really a misconception. I think it's important to state that, because it's a kind of misconception that has hung over our heads, really, and a mischaracterization of even, you know, GLC, ILEA funding and so on. So that's my bit on funding.
Yeah, I kind of get what you're saying, and I think it sort of resonates with some of the discussion we had at the end of the Heart of the Race. It is very true that our initial attempts to organise were done entirely on the basis of self-funding. If we needed money, we went and organised a jumble sale, or we held a collection, or we sold a newsletter, but we certainly didn't anticipate, expect, or even receive any money from anyone else. But post-81, you had the Scarman report, and I suppose sort of tongue-in-cheek, I'd say, you know, if it was black and unemployed, they threw money at it. There was that period, and there was a whole period where to some extent, gender and race equality politics became institutionalized through the establishment of women's equality units and race equality units in every borough that had a kind of a left-leaning leadership. And some people were brought into that structure. Not everybody. That's the whole point you're making. But some people were. And to some extent, it was a kind of creaming off process, because those were the people who had previously been activists in our organisation, now suddenly brought into a project which involved a wage at the end of the month. So you ended up having a stake in the system. So there was that kind of going on. But there was also a lot of divide and rule within that process of funding. You applied for funding on the basis of your ethnicity, yeah, rather than your aims and objectives. You tweaked your aims and objectives in order to get the money. So sometimes you had to water down what you set out to do simply because you needed that money so much. So there was issues like that. But I think it is absolutely right of Suzanne to say that not everybody took that money, and quite a lot of people who were able to access funds made good use of it. I mean, Yeah, it was our money anyway. I know the Brixton Black Women's Group, they had a premises in Stockwell Road that lasted, you know, long after OAD ceased.
Yeah, I guess with that point, it's not to say that taking funding was an example of kind of capitulating to Thatcherite politics or whatever. It is to say that parallel as like the more mainstream or as the women's liberation movement is developing, under this kind of policy environment of neoliberalism, you see the creation of the violence against women sector, which is exactly that, which is about service provision. And now as kind of younger feminists, I imagine a lot of younger feminists, especially people working on domestic violence, for example, find themselves in opposition actually to the claims set by those service providers, which started actually as having quite radical roots. Like I guess I'm trying to say I understand the complexity, and like a lot of younger feminists, I guess, look back on that time also as a time of great abundance in terms of the like what it enabled in terms of like mobilizations of different forms of like feminist organizing. So the recognition of that complexity is definitely there. I guess the point that I was trying to make is that when we're now we're organizing, the landscape has completely shifted, not only in terms of funding, there is none, but also in terms of police surveillance, right? Like it seems that the grip that policing has on our lives extends far beyond just being in the street or being at a meeting. It's now about like predictive policing, where you will be, how, you know, the facts of your life make you more likely to be criminalized in so many different ways. And I guess we're trying to think about the tools that, like, as a younger set of like organizers, how to deal with those. And there is no like neat or solid question. But yeah, that's where the idea of money comes in, because often we're stuck with these questions about like, we want to sustain long-term our organizing efforts, but because of the cost of living crisis and because education is no longer free and because there has been over the last 10 years widespread cuts to any form of welfare provision, it's incredibly hard to organize, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, there's a lot in the question. I think that probably it's not. It's, you know, we don't have the time to really properly, I think, interrogate the whole issue of funding. Because I do know what you're saying, and there was a time when I would have taken a very strong position against state funding and so on. But you know, I do believe that that money was ours. You know, it was our taxes. It was our parents' sweat and blood. You know, we were entitled to some of that. Some of it was misused, possibly. You know, but it was also important that some of the buildings that we're in that were leaking and that were, you know, you know, hard to let properties, abandoned buildings, and you know, we were entitled to that money to make those places habitable for the groups that we were organising in. So that's that. But in terms of, I think that 1981 report is might be used historically slightly in a slightly misleading way. And I do appreciate the fact that it has been made available, and it's a really interesting document. But I think it sort of suggests that we were okay with coordinating with the police, cooperating with the police in those kinds of, and that wasn't the case. That absolutely wasn't the case.
Yeah.
I mean, we're on record, all community groups, all local groups were on record taking a stance against cooperating with the police and often against submitting to those sorts of reports. I think the difference with that report is that it was very local and the tone of it was very different. And a lot of the people who were involved in the report, involved in steering the report, were also involved in the community, at community level. And so the register, the
Complete difference.
Garment report, it wasn't in any way similar to the McNee report that was published a little while earlier. It was something that I think we were taking control of, and I think you can see that from the outcomes and the objectives and the conclusions of the report, that the language was our language.
I will say on that, yeah, I completely agree with that. And in the report, they called the police an occupying army. And that's just the language, that kind of language would be outside of like, you know, a specific left corner of feminist organizing, kind of impossible to find. So I really understand and hold. Yeah, exactly,
Not in
exactly.
any way typical, and I think it would be misleading to suggest that you did work closely with the police.
Yeah.
Obviously you didn't. And lastly, on this idea of the grassroots organisations, and I think that is very important, and I hope that as a kind of intergenerational conversation, we do recognise the importance of organisations that emerge organically from communities, and that are not always ideologically matching. You know, they don't always provide a clear ideological fit. But what does it mean? What does it mean to be part of a grassroots organisation? What does it mean to be part of a community organisation? It means giving up a lot of your time, a lot of your well-being. It means, in the case of certainly an older generation, older than myself, of women, giving up a lot of personal care and personal obligations in order to look outwards and do the best for the community. So in a sense, it's about where that understanding of our relationship with each other, the individual and the community, the individual and the other, where does that sit in 2023? You know, and obviously things change, whole notions of society change, notion of the individual changes and so on, culture, all that changes. But at the same time, community groups they're not a kind of romantic thing that just happened in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and then suddenly, you know, we didn't get the funding and they collapsed. You know, it was really about a sort of vision, an understanding of the labour required, and ultimately, and I think fundamentally, and looking outwards, you know, looking beyond yourself to the others who needed your support, and a kind of sense that we need each other.
Yeah, which is, I think, at the heart and core of any kind of like feminist politic, right? Is this idea that we need each other. Stella, sorry. I had to-
No, I just wanted to pick up on your question earlier, Lola. You mentioned some names. Gerlin Bean, Olive Morris, Sylvia Erica. I think you mentioned Julia Sudbury in a different context. And yeah, I think it is important to just pick up on what Suzanne was saying, that because we organised in the spirit of collectivism, there was far less focus on individuals and named leaders. And even now to this day, you know, people like myself and Suzanne, perhaps because we wrote the book, you know, we're quite often wheeled on to talk to people, wheeled on, will be soon, to talk in groups like this. But, you know, we're just like the recognisable face. There were so many unnamed women whose names will never be mentioned other than in passing, who deserve to be acknowledged and recognised and honoured for their contribution. And I think Gerlin Bean in particular actually deserves a special mention, because she was so central to some of the initiatives that developed in Brixton, which in turn had an impact on other communities who saw that example and tried to follow suit. You know, Sabar Books, working around childcare provision, working to set up the Black Women's Group. There were so many quiet ways in which she moved mountains. And we did have some young sisters who died before their time, Sylvia, Erica, and Olive. Yeah, quite a few. And yeah, I guess, you know, part of our intention is to try and keep those names alive, simply so that they are acknowledged, but in a context where we recognise that most of the names will never really be named.
But there are women like who were pivotal, really, like Sybil Phoenix, for example, who's rarely called out.
Yeah, Gloria Cameron.
Were absolutely central. And for those of us who are in Lambeth, Irma Critchlow, I don't know, who was one of the first Black Labour councillors, who's a force of nature. who, you know, is also not able to speak for herself now. But and I'd like to, maybe, when I say naming, I'm talking about it figuratively. I mean, it's important to recognise that there were many, many women who were working in very sort of revolutionary, very radical ways, without the language perhaps, without that sort of abstract, that sort of sense of this abstract consciousness, but really giving it everything to make sure that young men were safe on the streets, to make sure that after school people had somewhere to go. At the end of it, to go into the schools. We were always in schools. I used to find myself always in schools, talking to head teachers, talking to the teacher, trying to get, you know, the child readmitted and that kind of thing. And so, and supporting grandmothers, mothers, aunts in that struggle. And I'm talking figuratively about naming, so remembering, you know, that there were hundreds of women who were, as you said, the gold. They were the gold that really made our community, ensured the survival of our community.
I guess, yeah, beyond this idea of the timeline or beyond this idea of key events, I find that there's, when we're talking about historicizing, there's often so much anxiety about what we can't and don't capture. And even in naming them, even in bringing them, even in remembering them, right? Like even at a relational level, not even thinking ideologically, like there is a way that we're able to commune and touch the past. Like as somebody who kind of researches like the archival material, archival material of political organizing groups. When I go into the archive and I read the OED first version of the Constitution, I get some sense of this like temporal echo or bounce back. Like feels like the past is still present, right? And it's constituting also how we move in the future and the decisions that we make as feminist organizers and thinkers.
Lola, can I just say one thing about Sylvia, because I think that's kind of something that's quite often forgotten, which is the personal, the human story. Sylvia died very young. She had a serious drink problem. I don't think that was a secret. And she had a brilliant mind. And she grappled for quite some time with issues of her identity. She was of mixed race, white mother, extremely racist. You know, all that stuff that goes on, trying to work out who you are in relation to. And she also had issues around her sexuality and working that out. And I think sometimes when you sort of read the official story, you know, these women got together and they organised and they changed the community and they did this and that. What is often forgotten is that kind of soft underbelly, you know, the fact that we are human beings. We were struggling with relationships, with childcare, with working out who the hell we were, with even the colorism within our own communities. We were young. Relationships, the brothers, you know, all of that was going on and all got thrown into the mix as well. To some extent, I'm kind of waiting for somebody to write the novel, because the novel kind of, you know, gets underneath the skin of all of that and brings things like the Constitution into focus. It makes you get a sense of the people who were behind that. And I just thought it was important to name Sylvia because she was a beautiful sister. And I name her and often do things and think this is for you, Sylvia, because you didn't live long enough to experience this or to go to this place or whatever. But I think for me, she symbolises so many young black women at the time who were grappling with all these issues. But despite all of that, got on with the business of trying to challenge police brutality, to demand equality and equal rights and justice and all those other big words that we talk about.
Yeah, I think also, I guess when we're thinking about women's role, like also, I think it's important as a researcher to also think about the role of, like, as you said, queer women in that, because that underbelly, the kind of life of, you know, the everyday, people's everyday lives were often, I guess, not thought of in political terms, right? And so it's important now as younger people who are engaging with that, who have a sense that like queer identity is related to capitalism, is related to all of these questions, norms about like how we should live, to, like you said, bring those kind of stories to the forefront, I guess, or to think about ways to grapple with the tensions that were that existed under this umbrella group and just at the time generally. I wanted to end with two questions, and they're not that long, I promise. I guess you spoke briefly about continuities, and you spoke briefly about resistance to the British Nationality Act of 1981, which rescinded the right of non-British citizens to reside in the UK. And I was thinking, sorry, 1981, I said. What?
71.
71, sorry. What connections are to be made there, I think, between like Thatcher's kind of fortification of the border, Fortress Europe, and the current kind of government plans for offshore detention of migrants and things like no recourse to public funds. Like I'm interested in, yeah, having lived through, you know, those bills passing, what your understanding of this political moment is in regards
How long
to
have you got?
migrant life.
How long have you got? You don't want to get me started on Priti Patel and what's her name? Cruella. I just no, I don't think I'm going to do that because we're on record. But you know, yeah, continuities. We're still dealing with that struggle. And something Akala said, which I really liked, and I think he deserves to be acknowledged for this quote. He said, "The people who mobilized and fought for this country in the Second World War, you know, our parents, our grandparents probably, and great-grandparents now, have less access to this country than the people we fought against." That's an interesting thought, isn't it, really? Because it shows just how history is made and skewed.
I think it's also, you know, I think the difference, it is a continuity, but it's a continuity with difference. And I do think that the difference relates to a consciousness about a critique of capitalism and imperialism, because the people who are the gatekeepers now look like us. So that is a challenge for us, but it's also directly related to colonialism and imperialism and the kinds of stratifications that were undergone by the British colonial system that are replicated in Britain today. And what amazes me is that the party of government are of course the ones who know how to replicate that system, because their foreparents were the instigators of that system. And so it comes very natural to them to use this buffer class, as we used to call it in the old days, the compradors, the buffer class, whatever, however you want to identify it, in order to, as a barrier between the white colonial elite or the white resident elite and the majority of the population. And I think that, in a sense, without a critique of imperialism, without an understanding of how colonial works at a deep level, I think it's quite easy to kind of just pick off individuals and not to see them as a class, and as individuals with a history of being part of that buffer class, you know. And it's important to be alert to that. So it is continuity, and it's continuity with a change, and maybe a continuity with a much further history than sometimes, you know, we want to think about. You know?
Yeah, and I think it picks up on something else for me. We've talked a little bit, haven't we, about the kind of influences that drove us, but we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that intersectional, what is nowadays called intersectionality. We just called it race, gender and class back in the day. But how important it is in any analysis of our struggle to keep class in mind and class interests in mind. Because if we go rah, 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 we're all black folks together and let's get on with it, then we lose sight of that, and we lose sight of those very, very insidious stratifications within our communities that can tear us asunder or can make us lose focus. And I like the fact that what is emerging I've seen in feminist discussions is this distinction between the kind of liberal feminism who think, you know, if we just got a few more women on the boardroom and in the media, that everything would be fine, hunky-dory. And a more radical vision of feminism, which is about saying we want fundamental change from the bottom upwards, and actually having Meghan, what's her name, Merkel, Beyonce, I don't know, Oprah Winfrey, those few black women who've made it, doesn't make the blindest bit of difference to the vast majority of dispossessed, exploited black women. And I'm going to get on my soapbox here a little bit because I know we're rounding up.
Please.
Black Lives Matter, wherever they are. Let's stop thinking just that they only matter because we're in the West. You know, I'm not in any way undermining the response to George Floyd's murder, although we could have made the same noise about Breonna Taylor and we didn't. But, you know, the lives of unnamed black folks, the women whose bodies are littering the English Channel and the Mediterranean, those lives matter too. And what it seems to me we have to reclaim as black people, if we're going to organise effectively, is that connectedness with our countries of origin, that ability to join the dots and to see where class and race and gender intersect and can sometimes throw up some serious contradictions. But also just recognise that we are, despite all the isms and schisms we talked about, we are actually relatively privileged. We don't live on a rubbish tip in Lagos. We don't live, you know, under the rubble in some building in Syria or Eritrea or wherever, you know. And we should be calling out the hypocrisies that we see coming from not just the Tories but the Labour, you know, about the differentiation between who is a worthy immigrant or a worthy asylum seeker and who isn't. Those kinds of things should be spoken about as loudly and as vehemently as things like police brutality, because it's another form of brutality, isn't it? It's a more insidious. You don't necessarily see the bodies littering the streets, or you don't see it on camera necessarily, but that's happening too to our black people and our black children. And I suppose that's me on my soapbox, really, that I think if our black feminism goes anywhere, it will keep that uniqueness, you know, that focus that is beyond just what we want as women, but what we want for our community, what we want for our society, what we want for our world, what we want for our children and grandchildren. That to me is at the heart of feminism, black feminism, and I hope it will stay there.
Thank you. I think to just round off, I guess it would be, because we're trying to make this an intergenerational conversation, good for me to, I guess, reflect as somebody who does black feminist organizing in the contemporary moment on what that looks like, you know? And I guess for me, when I hear you talk about, for me, I feel like feminism at this particular juncture is really involved and invested in continuing a lot of the critical legacies that were established by groups like OAD and Brixton Black Women's Group. Like I said, I think that the major terrain shifts are the things that stand in our way right now. Thinking about how, you know, loss of funding, thinking about like surveillance, for example. We've seen the ways that I think contemporary feminist movements are thinking about abolition, thinking about abolition of police power, thinking about the abolition of prisons, thinking about carceral landscapes and how prisons are used as a place where money flows through. I think that within those kind of radical circles, there is a critique of the border. There is a critique of like raids and migrant deaths and what's happening, like the fortification of the border regime. I guess I say this all because I really want to push back on this idea that somehow, because of the onset of identity politics, feminists in this contemporary moment don't have an adequate or robust critique of like race, class, and gender, and that everything is thought through the lens of a kind of neoliberal identity. That absolutely isn't true in terms of people thinking about the root causes and concerns of the issues that they're facing. I think your question, your point, Suzanne, about community was is really crucial and clear, because I think that that's something that is lacking, like a genuine sense of connection to people in a specific area. And that has to do with precarious housing. It has to do with the fact that you have to move every 3 years, like that there aren't that many places to gather anymore in terms of youth spaces and organizations. So those are the kinds of conditions in which Black feminism currently exists, but it also is thriving. I think it's also, in a way, reckoning with the gaps and tensions of the past in a very open and honest way, that isn't kind of, I guess, scared of fragmentation or disruption. It is asking questions about like what is called political Blackness, or the erasure of like queer life in forms of Black feminist organizing. And it is saying, actually, this history is a queer history, it's a socialist history, it's a Marxist history, it's our history in some sense, and we're our aim, I guess, is to continue it. I think I see often, like when I read documents and stuff, I'm like, someone I know could have written this. And then rather than that being depressing, for me, that's actually incredibly liberating, because it helps me think about time differently, and it helps me situate myself in terms of a legacy, which I think is super important. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for being here and being in conversation. I wonder if now would be a good time to kind of open up for thoughts, reflections, contributions that you can either pose to Suzanne and Stella, or just pose to the room generally. Oh, would you probably need a mic.
Thank you. Oh, is it on?
Yeah.
Is it on? Okay. Thank you. I am so grateful for everything that you've shared this evening. Yeah, sure. Okay. Thank you so much for sharing your lives and like your dedication to this struggle and having it be so personal. I guess I also really loved what you said about kind of bringing this beyond dates and facts and leaders, because it puts it in books, but this is people. People who don't have the same experiences with you. I'm specifically asking about men here in your organizing, where you can see that like the state is within the home, like say for example with domestic violence and stuff like that. How did you as organizers, with the radical ideas that you were having, kind of have accountability processes and discussions that didn't break connections between like this collective struggle of Blackness, but also like brought understanding? And my second question is connected to that, because you mentioned about your friend Sylvia, who passed away and had like mental health problems of addiction, and because we experienced recently like a loss within our collective, sorry. So I just wanted to know like your sustaining practices and how you've pushed through that, and how you've dealt with that.
How do you deal with grief?
I think it's really tough. I think it's, and I think Stella's going to talk personally, but we've all had, you know, it was a fragile time that we operated in. We were younger, I think, than most people in this room, and we didn't have very good. I speak for myself. I don't think I or people I knew had good coping skills, and I knew I was quite close to one of the sisters who had addiction problems and who kind of disappeared on and off and so on. And I don't think, because we didn't, and it was maybe a lack. We didn't open ourselves up to each other, and that, I think that was, looking back on it, I think that was a problem. We had. Stella talks about, you know, she talks about going out there, and we had these kind of personal issues, and then we did the struggle, but we showed to each other. We had a front. I feel we had a front, and to be completely honest, even in terms of Stella, I didn't know anything about Stella's kind of background or who she was, even though I'd worked with her. We did the book together, we go out together, but we had this, we did, and it was a function of the time, I think. And I feel that one of the consequences of that is that people found themselves very isolated, so that you're isolated in a crowd, you know. And I think that what's so important about the way young people organise now is the openness and the frankness and the honesty, and the willingness to just open, you know, yourselves up. Because I think as I get older, that's what sustained me. You know, a willingness to be vulnerable and so on. I mean, I almost think it's probably too late, but you know, I've arrived there. And I think that that's really what young people, you know, I see it in the young people I know, and I think it's such a strength, you know, to be open to your and others' vulnerabilities. And speaking by myself, I don't think I had that when I was younger.
Yeah, I can only echo that. I think from my own experience, it was about trust, who I could trust with my personal stuff. So you're right, there was a front, but there were one or two people who I might have confided in, but in a spirit of confidentiality, because in a way, those things made you vulnerable, you know, to own that you were in a shitty relationship or that you were having problems or whatever, that made you vulnerable. So, yeah, I think we probably could have done better. I'm often asked by young sisters, what did you do for self-care? And I always laugh because I think, we didn't. We smoked, we drank, we burnt the candle at both ends sometimes, and we didn't really focus on a lot of those issues that, you know, stood potentially to tear us apart. And I think people like Sylvia did become, you know, a casualty of that, and she's probably just an example of many. But I also know that, you know, unlike this generation, we didn't grow up with a kind of access to therapy. And my most enduring and effective therapists were my friends and sisters and aunties and granny, you know, the women in my life, and some men too, who just had the time to reason with me and to talk it through and to show me some wisdom. So to come back to your question, how do you cope? I think you just reach out to the people who you know will hold you and who will speak the same language, and just try to find a way to support each other through it. But I don't think I'd put ourselves up as a kind of role model for that, because in those days the personal was political, so you kept the personal out of sight, really. Yeah.
I had a comment, two questions really, but a comment. One was to do with the very same issue, which is the cultural component. Because as Black people, as Black women, we don't say, sure, you don't want to know about that thing. So we've, I think our generation have failed to pass on a lot of the activism, if you like, a lot of the going out there and doing and organizing to our children, which means that we have, although I'm listening to Lola and she says it's thriving, there's feminism and so on. If you were, again, we can't go across in a sort of a homogeneous, if you're in the academic world, if you're in the reading world, but a lot of our young people are not. And a lot of them are still bleaching and still doing the things that we were fighting so hard against. I just pick on bleaching because but there are a lot of other things. And we ask ourselves, what is your awareness, your self-awareness? So I think that we're not all the same across the board, and it makes organizing difficult, plus the fact that our generation really didn't share. We didn't sit down, we didn't have this opportunity to have these intergenerational conversations. So, you know, when you ask, so what did you do? You still say, Sure, nobody asked me that. You know, these are things that it's almost an embarrassment. It comes back to the same sort of shame and embarrassment you get when people ask about slavery. We don't speak about, we don't tend to, our generation, go into a discussion of the impacts. But that's just the cross-cultural thing really hit home. The other thing I wanted to ask is related directly to the Reclaim Community Heritage Project. Suzanne, you were saying, both in fact said, how are some of the ways do you think that we can remember the names of the women? This is part of one of the things that the project is asking. How can we remember? How can we create the memories for ourselves? And I mean, Yvonne is here, that article in the Evening Standard about a monument for the remembrance of slavery. How are we going to remember? What are the ways we're asking in this project? How can we? Do we write poems on the street? Do we put up monuments? Do we have information? Do we call people's names as we go through? How can we remember?
Thank you. I have like 7 questions in my mind, but I'm just gonna, just, oh, sorry. Thank you. Comment was, I think, how can we remember? I recently started writing stories, and there was a quote, I think that was in the mail out from this thingy, that was about Alice Walker saying, I read history not for information, but for clues. And I'm really thriving at the moment on rewriting fictional stories about queer feminists from the 17th century that I'm like, I know you were there, and I know that's why I'm free, and thank you for that. And so sometimes the stories that we can't put exact names or words to, I think we have to tell them anyway. Then I had a question to the panel as well. That was, it was something that I feel like confuses me quite consistently, is around, in my experience of Black liberation movements in the UK, over the last like 6 or 7 years, there's often, I actually find, like, I'm not sure I've had the same experience of you, I feel like I found a lack of lens around colonialism and imperialism, and both how that can be perpetuated by Black folks working in the UK in terms of how that connects geopolitically, but also just kind of like an internal inward-looking thing. And I think it always confuses me because there's a narrative that we're more connected than we ever have been globally. But actually, I feel like, yeah, I'm always just a bit confused as to why it often feels like when I look at Black feminist movements, not that long ago, international work felt more part of the praxis, like in terms of like, I think maybe it was you, Stella, that was telling me about a visit that you and Gerlin had done once. Was it in South Africa maybe? I can't remember.
States, it was the States.
Yeah, and I'm like, I've been in the game a minute and I've never done that, you know? Like, and so just, yeah, that kind of curiosity of like, actually, how can we be more consciously building an anti-imperial Black feminist struggle in today's context, using both the tools that we have now and the tools that we've always had. Like I was reading about Marcus Garvey's translator, a French-English translator in like 1816, or I think I've got Marcus Garvey's dates very wrong there, but I was just like, I just feel like if that could have been then, we could probably do that now too. So that was the actual question.
I'm not sure what the question is.
The question's going to be the answer? Yeah.
Yeah, I've kind of lost the question, but I think there was an issue about connectivity, wasn't there, and connectedness, and I'm with you. I think, you know, we're connected with anyone at the touch of a button now in a way we weren't before, and yet we're not always sure who we're connecting with, and there is a tendency, isn't there, to sort of stay within your silo, you know, to connect with people who share the same, you know, identity or perspectives as you, which I think can cut you off from a lot of potential and growth. So I think that would be one point, that, you know, when you make your connections with people, whether they're near or far, you know, don't just limit yourself to people who speak the identical language, because actually there's a lot of learning to be done from people who are different and who don't necessarily agree with you, and who you can have a healthy debate with. I think that's one of the problems I have with this sort of cancel culture, that, I don't know, it's the educator in me, but I personally think that there's a lot of mental colonization that still exists, and a lot of confusion, and we should, in the spirit of love and mutual support, be able to have a healthy debate about what we disagree about as well as what we agree about. You know, I think cancel culture can be quite insidious in terms of forcing people or preventing people from speaking their minds and having a genuine interaction and a genuine connectedness. What else was there?
There was a question about men in the group. It was
Oh,
your
yeah,
first question, wasn't it? That we've forgotten. And I think it's a good question. It's not something that I think we've got time to discuss in detail now. But I think it you know, it came to it. We always worked with groups that were dominated by men, and then even when we worked with mixed groups, quite often those mixed groups were dominated by men who were dominant, and but I think it sort of probably came to a head after the uprisings, when we had the Brixton Defence Campaign and the Legal Defence Campaign, when we were working on a daily basis every evening, organising with other groups headed by men, and then we were in a kind of communication or whatever with Race Today and groups like that, and it was extremely difficult, and it wasn't difficult. It wasn't a gendered. It wasn't a difficulty that I think exposed itself along gender lines so much as I think, well, maybe, yeah, the sort of gendered ideology and an understanding of power, and I think, and oddly enough, as an anecdote, Stella alerted me to something that's on the BCA website, and it was a letter that I'd written. I just circulated to everybody, as if I was the secretary of the organisation. And then in an interview, I remember saying that I used to take all the minutes and do the admin. And I wanted to cross that out and say, because it sounds, you know, such a stereotypical role, but actually that's what the women were doing in those in all of the mixed organisations that we had. And it did, and it ultimately it was at a cost to us personally, and at a cost to the organisation, because it's not about doing those things. Somebody's got to do them. Somebody's got to write the letter. Somebody's got to take the minutes. But it's about the fact that when there's a public platform around those issues, you're still taking the minutes, and somebody else is fronting it, and that's really the sort of crisis. And I think that you know, we learnt a lot from that around power, the way that power's always gendered, and the way that Labour's always gendered, and the importance of not always feeling that you've got to do the Labour, you know, just because the Labour presents itself, you know, just like the poem, you know, you kind of perform to that type, you know. Yeah, yeah. So that was a kind of answer to that question. Not an answer, but just an address.
Also just like curious about like when you've got these issues in the home of like women who are experiencing domestic violence or sexual assault, like how did you reckon with these very personal issues that are political, and like as like black feminists who are really doing the work and not having people who are very close to you respect you in that way, how did your ideas that you were talking about outside kind of impact your home life?
I think you know, we were having those discussions amongst ourselves, and sometimes developing a political position around those issues, but in terms of like dealing with a sister who was dealing with, I don't know, domestic violence at home or any of the other issues that women deal with, we dealt with them the way we've always dealt with them. We turned to the people who were there to support us. We put up with it, or we didn't. We walked out, or we didn't. We took the kids with us, or we didn't. Just the way women deal with those issues now. There was far more less talk about those issues in those days. And in a way, I kind of feel, I don't really know how to articulate this. I think I'm getting a bit tired now, so it's going to come out of there. But, you know, I quite often talk about the anti-racist racist, yeah? So stay with me for a minute. You know, the person who can speak the language of anti-racism but still be racist, yeah? And I think there was an element of that going on in terms of the male-female relationships, if that makes sense, that you had some brothers who said all the right revolutionary things and stood up on the spot, but when you looked at their personal relationships or what they were doing with women, you know, it weren't nothing to be really proud about. But then, you know, the corollary of that were the brothers who came along to our conferences and manned the creche while we got on with the discussions, or who ran the bookshop for us. You know, it's such a nuanced picture. It's really hard, as Suzanne said, to really do justice to it. But I think, you know, if we had to sort of sum it up in a nutshell, that people just got on with it. And, you know, I say it for now, I lived with years with an alcoholic partner. I don't think any of the women in OAD even knew about it. I just kept it quiet. And when I was ready, I left. You know, and I'm sure that they gave me that strength and perspective, but it wasn't something necessarily that it was being discussed. So there's no single answer to that. I think there's a whole plethora of different responses. How are we doing for time?
Just wanted to make a couple of comments just to add to some of the organising work that was done, because actually one of the areas that myself, Arlene, Ezra, Julieta, Nefertiti, and other women that I'm just naming here were involved in at the time was a whole development of youth and community work. You know, we came from, we went off to college, many of us in the 1980s and late 70s and 80s, and then got involved in communities and organising through that work. And as you were speaking, I was just completely thrown back to the early 80s. And thinking about Arata Bar as a Black women, Asian women's group that we set up. And I think it's really important, again, I'm just really struck by the names, just from remembering the women that were involved in the youth work, working with young women, particularly with young Black women and young Asian women at the time. Maria, who passed away, yeah, sure, Maria Downward. And others, yeah, no. And just on the point of stories and remembering women. You know, I would just really like to remember my mother here this evening. She was from a very small village in Jamaica, semi-literate, went to basic school. But when she came here in the 50s, in 1971, when I went to go and transfer from primary to secondary school, she was asked if she was a British citizen by the head teacher. And when I think about 71 and the relevance of that in terms of the door coming down, yeah, absolutely, about entry in this country. And I didn't get offered the school that I'd applied for. My white friends, 5 white friends, who'd also applied for the same school, they all got in, and I didn't. So we campaigned. I was homeschooled for 3 months. We had Black activists and Black students from Goldsmiths come to my home and homeschool me until we eventually got letters flying around. Race Equality Council, local authority, education, and so on. Newspapers, there was, as you said, no mobile phones, nothing, but Gestetners and all sorts of things were being used to get information.
Bander machine. And the duplicator.
Bloody blue ink. There was ink, yeah, that would stay on your fingers for days just to get information out. And I share this story because 3 months later, we got an offer for another school and we accepted it. I didn't go to school till January 72. I'm just sharing this story because those women who didn't go to college, university, even secondary school, who also stood in these communities here in the UK and actually said no to the state. I think we also need to remember them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
I just feel like there was something that was on my mind throughout the evening, and then what you just said made me want to do this. I guess it's part of making the personal part of the collective consciousness. And I think it's very important for us to remember that for me, it's my parents' generation. So that Windrush generation, what we call now the Windrush generation, whether or not they came from the Caribbean or wherever they came from, that they didn't come here without any political consciousness, which we tend to kind of have this idea that it develops when they come to Britain. And when I think about my mother, who had been very active here in Lambeth in the 70s and 80s, it was only maybe 2 years ago that I discovered that she had been an activist in Jamaica before she came here. She came here in '52. She had been part of the anti-colonial movement in Jamaica. She had campaigned in the first elections in Jamaica, and she brought that consciousness with her to the UK. She was active in the West Indian Standing Conference, and you talked about the anti-colonial consciousness. And I can remember as a child I don't know if it was, do I want to give away my age? But I think it was probably the 70s now, early 70s, when in our little council flat in Shoreditch, where we lived, we had not refugees, what's the word I want? People who'd had to flee from anti-colonial struggles in Mozambique and Angola, meeting in our little flat. And this was the connection between, everyday on the street Caribbean activism, more kind of global anti-colonial movement. So I think it's really important that we recognise that and resist this idea that we arrived in Britain without any political consciousness or without a history of struggle before we got here. Or our parents, I should say.
How are we doing for time?
I think we've exhausted our conversation. Well, we haven't. There's still so much to say. Lola, I'm going to hand over to you to
I think everybody is kind of tired. But
Feels like midnight. What time is it?
yeah, there are. I'll say like two short things. In response to what you said about, I guess, a loss of connectivity across borders, I'm really interested in that question as well, and I think it has something to do with like following on from like the people who had an anti-colonial consciousness in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, how they like were able to properly name themselves as revolutionaries, and that was understood within like loads of geographical context. Like I think when we look back at what is like the radical heyday of that kind of organizing, Marcus Garvey, etc., and their ability to make connections, it was like on the basis of their shared politics. And I feel like not that has been lost, but I agree with you. It's harder to name yourself because of like counterinsurgency and like all of the ways that the state is now actively intervening in forms of organizing. It's harder to name yourself openly as a revolutionary. I want to enter this country. I want to like gather large groups of people together because of that surveillance apparatus. So I think that that's something that's like a big thing. And I guess I just wanted to also make a comment when I was saying like the things that younger feminists are facing. I think we're also looking at the ways like currently that a lot of the like mainstream like white feminist organizers are allying with like fascists and have a really like biologically essentialist understanding of like race and gender and stuff like that. So we're seeing the ways that gender becomes mobilized in the very service of like the nuclear family and patriarchal relations. And that's something that we're having to, I guess, remake a lot of the same arguments that you guys were making as well. I feel like we should draw to a close. Should we do like just last very brief and short comments so that we can all get home? Yeah. Oh, you've forgotten it. Okay.
Oh no.
Oh, and the people in the live stream? Oh, they won't be.
Hi, hello. I just wanted to state something about what you mentioned about the state. Um, it's not just the revolutionaries coming here, it's their idea of their heritage. So we can have a whole 100,000 revolutionaries in our cities right now, but their idea of their heritage seems to weigh more than our idea of our struggle. And we need to switch that around. It's not about going to Kew Gardens and checking out Kew Gardens, because when you go there, you go to Little Japan, you see where I'm going with this? You go to these places that are multiculturally faceted, but then they're faced by a white man or faced by a Asian man. Not to say that Asians aren't on our side, but majority of the time they tend to lean towards the white man, especially when you meet them in real life. Yeah, so there's another thing you said about just going in and trying to remember, but it was really important because I had the comment and then I forgot. But I just wanted to also mention how wonderful this is, because where I come from, my dad's white. He grew up with a Cuban general as a dad. So I know what it's kind of like with the revolutionaries coming here in the 70s, trying to make their lives here. My granddad there, Jamaican, he's Scottish, so he grew up with a black dad, so he thinks he's black. You know, he's not like he used to do really strange stuff trying to be black. And he's put that into me. So I grew up with like dancehall culture as like my upbringing, like grime music, all of these things were heavily influenced. But when I look at the world outside, because of how this system's built, it's a capitalist system. So I don't think, oh yeah, let me help out all these people that are struggling. I think, let me get my money first to do that. So where you guys are going, oh, roots movements are the best, that's a new thing for a lot of us younger generations. We're like, oh wait, we can do that? Because we've just gone through 16 to 20 years of educating ourselves through the idea of competition. So it's like, I'm talking to you here and I'm like, oh wait, no, don't say that, because at every point in juncture that she's made, I feel like there's still more points to be added. There's still more things to be talked about. It's not just like, oh yeah, let me say one thing that's gonna encompass the whole. No, this is a very deep topic. They've literally taken people's lives who could have been great speakers, who could have been great people, and they are nobodies now. And that's really disturbing, because I feel like I'm a nobody some days, but I know when I look at my history and then I look at like things that happened, and then you go do like Mayan astrological stuff, or you do stuff that's from indigenous cultures, like the Ifa Oracle or something, and it shows you like stuff that is really intricate to your life, far more intricate than these white ideas of zodiacs and all these white ideas that they've built over time through alchemy. Even the time they've made is a trap. So they're not trying to think that this system they put you in is a system that is for your benefit, even if you benefit through it, even if you see what you're talking about, the class thing, and you say, oh, the black people are all in these different classes and we can't really bring ourselves together because it separates us. You're right, but as soon as you meet some of the younger kids in there, they don't want to separate it. So I feel like where you guys are coming from on these topics is probably not as harsh as how we're experiencing it. So again, it's just this money thing. Everyone just wants to make money, and it's really disturbing. Grassroots gets lost. You have to find that. You have to force yourself to find it. If you're not brought up in it, you know, it's quite scary.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah, it's quite like intimidating as well, because you enter into these spaces hoping that you can bring something to it, but there's nothing to be brought. There's just stuff to be learned. So, you know, so this is an interesting time. It's a very interesting. I'm really glad I came here and heard you. Wonderful women speak.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to take the mic, and there's one more question that I'd like to, or one more comment that I'd like to introduce, and then I'd like to give you some feedback from the buzzing conversation that's been happening online.
Yeah, not a question, just a reflection actually, which I had at the end of I suppose like the kind of main part of the conversation that you had. And it was what really struck me was there was talk during the conversation around the kind of continuity between the challenges and the issues that are being faced. But Stella, when you kind of gave your final reflections around, and you're calling out what's going on with kind of migrants and refugees and borders, and what really struck me there was a continuity between the radical black feminism that I've kind of exposed myself through reading work like Lola has put together, and the continuity between that and kind of your own kind of stance and point there. And I suppose I know your names, but your work less, I would say, and it just really struck me, that continuity there, and as a really beautiful thing, and as a really it struck me how important it is to create these forums and these conversations and these intergenerational conversations for us to come together and experience that continuity on that side of things as well. So thank you all for.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joss. So the online conversation has been buzzing. There have been people, certainly in London, in Nottingham, in Brighton, in Oxford, but also in Atlanta and on the island of Reunion. They tuned in to listen to you. And people have been asking lots of things. Why is money / compensation a dirty word when it comes to black folk? The political structures that fund policing as an organization have not changed. This is one of the reasons why progress seems to be arrested if we observe what is happening in immigration. Do we think the police has really learned anything since 1981? I would just like to acknowledge, bear witness to the richness of the conversation that has occurred this evening. There are many ways in which folks are on similar pages. There are many ways in which folks differ, and the care with which people have brought their own perspectives to bear on this situation, but also listened to the perspectives of people who might think differently. This is a model, I think, for us for thinking of how do we approach inheriting our heritage. How do we approach the business of reclaiming what is ours, which has been denied us, which has been neglected? I encourage you to think about the ways in which the conversation has actually occurred here this evening. Think about the ways in which you could reproduce that sort of care and attention and listening in your own families and in your friendship groups and with people who are not in your generation. And I'd also encourage you to look at the Reclaim Black Heritage Fund opportunity that is on the 81 Acts of Exuberant Defiance website, 81actsofexuberantdefiance.com, and apply. Just put in an application before the deadline on Monday. There's up to £4,000 available for you to reclaim the history, to remember the names, and to remember the collectivities that have gone before us on whose shoulders we stand. It's not for me to conclude. I'd like to invite I'd like to thank our invited guests. Thank you very much, Stella. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Lola, for holding the floor. Appreciate it. And I'd like to invite Cherie to play us out to conclude with a single poem. And then there is a Prosecco reception in the kitchen for those who have the time to stay. Are you okay with the...
Yeah, I will be for this, that's fine.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, I'm kind of... Yeah, that was just, as a SOAS graduate who's studied things, that was just so enlightening. And yeah, I took notes and notes and notes, and yeah, it's just a privilege to kind of hear your stories and to learn from, there's an energy you guys give out, which is so kind of empowered and powerful, but full of love, you know. And I just think it's, when the people talk about the way this conversation's gone, because I was in the green room with you guys, you know, and yeah, it's just been a real privilege. And yeah, and in the spirit of kind of the intergenerational conversations, particularly between women, this last poem is about my female friendships, but really it's about all female friendships. And yeah, like one of the people who kind of inspired this poem was Jenny Zobel. Good point. Was Jenny Zobel, who was And just a good friend who was 30 years older than me, who was the first radio producer at the BBC, who had met, you know, Senghor, you know, who, the architect of negritude, and I learnt so much from her. But similarly, my son's maths tutor, who was 19 years old, and he would teach him, and then we'd sit for hours and talk about local black issues, diasporal black issues. So this is really just about how together as women and as black women, we're more than the sum of our parts, and it's called sisterhood. I have these friends who are a soft place where my spirit can rest. When I have my lost face, they second guess, unspoken see the scars, because we're broken by same tests. Straight down the line, no hidden bends. They take my despair and make it hope through their lens and refract back the light my own spirit couldn't send. I take over the dance floor, push you to advance more. Arrive in tears at each other's door. Stay for one more, friend. I've got a friend who is an ego eroder, a patriarchy decoder, and I'm so glad I told her. A fellow female soldier with bolder life on shoulders who forms Black Power fist with me, informed on the history that sold us. We're calmer as we let their melanin karma armor mold us. And we've got iron ore cores of causes forged in fire, of lauding Audre Lorde, Maya inspired, creating gold and a phenomenal woman bold us. Because we are sister outsiders. We are still we risers. We are reminders that the pain storms cease, but our warm laughter reigns inside us forever. We are self-care silver liners. We are sunshiners of a peace unweathered that we defend. And as glass ceilings fall, binds us to the belief we all can mend, we all can ascend, because we have these no longer alone friends, as if I'd always known friends. Mother, sister, home, I missed a dynamic universe, kissed friend. A panoramic new horizon uncurls. Steady, stable, ready for seat at the table, but also able to unfurl. Because we are grown hard to shock women, safe in showing sometimes we are thrown vulnerable, rocked girls. Thank you.